We think about our job security with the rise of artificial intelligence that is keeping salaries lower for many of us while companies kind of hedge their bets. We think about the economics and political things that are going on for us. So those things show up as cost of living at the individual scale, but actually sitting behind it is this complex system of change.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for leaders at every stage who want to stay relevant in a world that keeps changing. Leadership has shifted. The pace is faster, the expectations are higher, and the future is calling for a different kind of leader. One who is human-centered, grounded, and able to balance capability with empathy. These conversations bring together global perspectives on the skills and mindsets that help people and organizations thrive. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. Today, I'm joined by someone who has become a trusted voice on the emotional and social foundations of work. Dr Michelle McQuaid is a senior fellow at the University of Melbourne and the founder of Change Labs, where she has spent more than a decade helping leaders, teams, and entire organizations understand what helps people truly thrive. Michelle returns to the podcast at a moment when, to be honest, many workplaces are feeling a little frayed at the edges. Leaders are navigating a pace and complexity of change that simply didn't exist a few years ago. Employees, especially younger workers, are feeling the weight of cost of living pressures and the uncertainty of global events and the constant churn of organisational change. And somewhere in the middle sits this question: how do we help people not just cope, but genuinely thrive in environments that are shifting faster than our systems, our skills, and sometimes even our nervous systems? This year, Michelle and her team set out to understand that question through a comprehensive piece of research. More than 1,000 workers across Australia took part in the Change Labs 2025 Workplace Report. A deep look into wellbeing, psychosocial safety, and the emotional of the supercycle of change we find ourselves in. And what the research uncovered is striking. More than half of Australian workers say they are quietly cracking, not burning out, not falling apart publicly, but holding it together on the outside while slipping on the inside. Younger workers are feeling it more intensely. Leaders are feeling worn down in different ways, and across all levels, poor change management and the cost of living crisis are shaping how people show up every day more than we may have realised. Michelle's insights into what quietly cracking actually looks like, the conditions that fuel it, and the practical tools leaders can use to interrupt it couldn't be more timely. Her heart framework for navigating change, her work on psychological safety, and her understanding of how our brains handle complexity gives leaders a roadmap for the decade we are stepping into. This is such an important conversation for every leader who knows their people are carrying more than they can see, and for anyone who suspects they may be quietly cracking themselves. Well, hello, Michelle. Welcome back to Future Fit Leadership. So good to see you again. How are you?
I'm well. It's so lovely to be back with you and all your lovely listeners.
So I'm excited to talk to you today because you did some research recently, and I'm going to get the name of the report right. It's called the Change Lab 2025 Workplace Report, and I was very lucky to get a copy of it earlier in the year. I'd love to know what made you decide to do a research piece, because it's never easy to do research and you've got to have so many different conversations and then look at the data and assess what the results are. So what made you put yourself through that?
I have to confess, I am a bit of a data nerd. I do like a good piece of data, mostly because it sparks my curiosity as to, what is going on here? Why is that happening? What do we do about it as leaders? And then it very quickly follows with my creativity of trying to go, well, how do busy leaders put this into play practically? So I do love a good bit of data. We have in the past done these large population studies with more than 1,000 workers across Australia, representing representative of our working population by gender and age, location, trying to get a really solid mix of industry, different types of businesses, government, private, big, small, regional, metropolitan, to really see inside what is happening for workers on the ground in these moments. And we use an independent research agency to gather that sample. So it's not off our list, which has a certain bias to it,
Yeah.
obviously. And then they ask us, answer a set of quantitative questions, both scale questions on a scale of 0 to 10. How do you feel about this? But also free text questions. And then we get all those beautiful results and we start crunching the numbers and really looking for the patterns that are practically helping us understand what's going on. And this particular set of data I went to gather because in the first 6 months of 2025, we've worked for more than a decade supporting wellbeing, psychosocial safety, change in workplaces. But at the start of 2025, it felt like something different was happening.
Mm.
And the way I was describing it at the time was like we could see people's nervous systems look like they were fraying a bit more, like all the resilience skills and wellbeing programs and psychosocial safety controls just didn't seem to be having the same impact as we'd seen in the past. And we couldn't quite make sense of why. And then around about May, June, we saw this term come out of the US, actually in a piece of wellbeing data. It wasn't what they measured, but they wrapped the results together and they described it as people were quietly cracking.
Mm.
It's like, oh, that sounds exactly like what I'm
Mm.
seeing in Australian workplaces. And we started testing it with some of our clients, going, do you feel like people are quietly cracking? And heads would start nodding vigorously as soon as
I'm
you
nodding
said
my head
those
as you
words.
say it. Yes,
I'm sure
absolutely.
many of our listeners are as well. And I was curious because they hadn't tested that term exactly and they hadn't defined it with people as a result. So I was like, I wonder if Australian workers are quietly cracking. And if they are, what the heck do they mean by that? And
Mm.
what are the causes of it? And what do we do about it?
So before we get into the whole quietly cracking piece, you interviewed over 1,000 people
Yes.
across many different industries, roles and backgrounds, which is great because, that's what you need to have those numbers when you do a research in Australia. Was there any demographic patterns that stood out for you straight away when you looked at the data really quickly and you went, oh, that stands out for me?
Yeah, the first headline we really saw was that 1 in 2 workers, 55%, said, yes, I'm quietly cracking. And then we went straight to age groups, genders, industries like, is there any pattern in this data that tells us some people are feeling this more than others? And it was age group. Our youngest workers were really feeling that quietly cracking pressure much more than our older workers. And so 2 in 3 of our younger workers aged 18 to 24 were saying, I really feel like this is describing how I feel right now. So overall, across the whole population, 1 in 2 workers. But when we narrow it by age group, we look at 18 to 24-year-olds. There we go up to 2 in every 3.
I find that really interesting because I actually expected you to say older workers were cracking. Was there something that came out in the research that stood out as to why the younger generation of leaders were cracking more? Is it the resilience piece? Is it the environment? Like, was there something in particular that stood out?
Yeah, look, I think context always matters in
Mm.
terms of what might be impacting these things, as well as then what are the skills and resources we have within us to meet that context. So I'm always curious on both of these dimensions. The first thing that really stood out was the context in which we are in right now. And 2/3 of all workers said, you know what, the thing that's causing me to quietly crack are external factors in the world. And in particularly, it was cost of living crisis. 41% of all age groups said it is cost of living that is really pushing us towards this quiet cracking. And then a third of it was work related. And so we looked across all sorts of psychosocial safety hazards. The biggest thing in workplaces was poor change management.
Mm.
And when we look at these things, to me, that makes sense as to what we were seeing about this fraying of nervous systems, this quiet cracking that's going on. in that we really, I think in 2025, started to see more, feel more this super cycle of change in which we find ourselves. So the World Economic Forum, even back as far as 2016, was starting to identify that we are coming into what they describe as a polycrisis, sort of multiple crises unfolding simultaneously that are colliding and amplifying. And they identify these around themes like economics, politics, social change, environmental pressure, technological shifts, so artificial intelligence. I think we've all felt that, right? The start of
Mm,
this year, it was like we could see in America and Ukraine and Palestine and floods in Queensland that interrupted our supply chains at the start of the year for weeks at a time. Like we've all felt this kind of amplifying, colliding of change at a complexity and a pace that none of us have really lived through before. We've had one of the longest periods of stability and peace that the world has ever seen, really, the last 50 odd years. And now suddenly it's this shift that is becoming quite apparent to all of us. So that cost of living crisis, I think of, is just the pointy end of all of that super cycle of change that is going on, because where we feel all those things coming into play is in our hip pocket when we go to
mm,
pay for groceries because, either the war in Ukraine has depleted wheat supplies or the floods in Queensland destroyed access to fruit and vegetables for a while. So we're all paying more, right?
mm,
We think about our job security with the rise of artificial intelligence that is keeping salaries lower for many of us while companies kind of hedge their bets. We think about the economics and political things that are going on for us. So those things show up as cost of living at the individual scale, but actually sitting behind it is this complex system of change. So that's a bit to take in. I'll pause there, but we can also talk about skills and resources as well. And if we think about our young people, why might cost of living impact them most? They're normally younger in their roles, being paid less money, have less savings in the bank, and so they're much more vulnerable to that cost of living pressure.
mm. It's also the age group, while you were talking, I was just thinking it's also the age group where, they want to get into housing for
Yeah,
themselves as well. And, you
yeah,
remember a time when, there was a generation that you could go and buy a house in your mid
right.
20s. At the moment, affordability is cutting into the housing sector as well.
Yeah,
There's interest rates, and we're now talking about interest rates going up next year.
yeah,
There's a real rental crisis where there's not
yeah,
enough rental properties.
yeah.
There's not enough properties being built to bring onto the market as quickly as it could be. So when you look at that generation, that age group that you have identified are quietly cracking, there's a lot for them to take in.
It really is.
So how does that then impact how well they thrive in the workplace? Because, from a leadership perspective, we've got to acknowledge that in terms of this is how these individuals are feeling because of all the things that they can't control. They can't control what's happening in the US or the war in
Yeah,
Gaza or the floods in Queensland or everything that we've talked about to right now is completely out of their control.
right. And
So,
out of the control of leaders
yeah,
trying to
100%,
support these people,
everybody,
right?
right?
Like, what
Yeah,
am I as a leader going to do about the cost of living crisis
you
that you
can't.
might be navigating?
You
Yeah.
can't. But how do I ensure that these people are still able to thrive in my business?
Yeah, so this comes to the skill set, right? Context, as you're pointing out, it's one thing most of us don't have a lot of control over context, but how we meet that context in the moment generally comes back to the knowledge, the skills, the support that we have within us, each of us individually, but also between us, within leaders and teams and organizations as well. So this is the bit that becomes more in our control. One of the things I mentioned at the start, we were curious about what does quiet cracking even mean? Like, although we'd seen this term pop up, as soon as we'd say the words, people's heads would start nodding. Like, but what is this? And in order to understand the knowledge, the tool support we need to navigate it, we need to know what it is. So we asked people who indicated that they were quietly cracking in this survey in a free text response, like, what does quiet cracking look like, feel like, sound like to you in your own words? And what we found was this really consistent pattern of three factors of quiet quiet cracking. The first was that on the outside, I'm holding it all together. And we
Mm.
saw this in the quantitative data. It was so interesting that if I'm not quietly cracking at all, on average, people's performance was sitting at about 77 out of 100, a score of 100. The moment they start quietly cracking, they drop 66 out of 100, so like a 10-point drop. But then when they start to tell us, I'm really now often quietly cracking, performance does this U-curve shape and it comes back up towards a 72 out of 100. So it doesn't get back to the 77 where it started if we're not cracking, but it does rally from this sometimes cracking to often cracking stage. And we really see that as a picture of what they were telling us in their own words, that I'm really trying to hold it all together on the outside. The second factor, though, is that they are hiding and masking. The third factor, that on the inside they're falling apart. And we saw this. We measured thriving for people when they were rarely cracking. They were sitting at 67 out of 100. But the moment they sometimes or often crack, we don't see this U shape like in performance. It just comes straight down and it stays there at around about 53 out of 100. So it's quite a significant drop there from I'm not cracking to suddenly I am cracking. Now, I think what's interesting in that is the second element of the hiding and masking that's going on, because any of us who've tried to hide or mask something knows it takes a lot of energy and
Effort.
effort, and it becomes less and less sustainable over time to hide the fact that we're falling apart. And what we found is that actually this quiet cracking is a precursor to burnout. And
Mm.
once I'm quietly cracking, I'm 6 times more likely to wind up burnt out than workers who are not quietly cracking. And that's where this really takes us long term. And of course, we know the impact that has on performance and productivity and all sorts of other important
Mm.
outcomes for us.
So, how wellness programs then become very critical in workplaces? And it's not just, I'm going to go and meditate on a Wednesday
Yeah.
afternoon kind of stuff. What are some of the things that particularly this cohort of young people want from businesses to support them through not quietly cracking, or if I am quietly cracking, to come and have that conversation to say, I need to do this and this. Like, I go totally straight into solution mode because that's where my head goes to. If I had someone in my business that I saw was quietly cracking, I'd be going, how do I help her not do that and, turn it around for her? So what are some of the things that we can do?
Yeah, look, I think it helps us as leaders to take a look at this through a systems lens,
Yep.
because this does ripple at all levels. And when I look through a systems lens, I like to think about the us level. What can we do at the organisational level first? And so here the data was very clear that at an organisational level, we need to be keeping our eye on those psychosocial hazards and trying to make sure that the demands we're making of our workers are reasonably balanced to the resources that we're providing.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing we can do at an organisational level, which was such an interesting finding I didn't expect in the data, is that we really need to keep our eyes on workplace civility. So what tended to happen was that as people quietly cracked, civility started to nosedive, that sense of respect and care in our relationships as we're working with each other. And what was even more fascinating is we found that the more often people were using AI tools in their work, the more likely civility was to decline as well. So I think there's this interesting mix at an organisational level as we bring in more AI tools to really be keeping our eyes on what impact is this having on our working relationships, our level of civility, if at that organisational us level of the system, we want to protect our people from quiet cracking. I'm going to come back to team and leader because I think there's most to play
Mm.
for there that'll be of interest for your listeners. But just to say at the individual level of the system, the me level, I think about it, there's also important things that we can do around wellbeing that aren't necessarily obvious to many of our workplace wellbeing programs right now. The first of that was that workers who were using their strengths, the things they're good at and enjoy doing, when they had meaningful chances to use their strengths regularly at work, they were 30% less likely to be cracking. And this reinforces decades of Gallup's research around, do you have a chance to do what you do best each day at
Mm.
work? And this
Mm.
is because it builds confidence, right, in the midst of that challenging context. But the second individual element was around self-compassion. This, can we be a wise and kind friend to ourselves rather than filling ourselves with self-doubt and self-criticism as we try to navigate this difficult context? And so workers who were practicing self-compassion actively showed a 31% less likelihood of being of cracking at work. So self-compassion, we've just found in some other data, really is the thing that underpins so much of our well-being. To me, it's often been a skill in workplaces we feel is a bit soft. If
Mm.
everyone's self-compassionate, they'll just be letting themselves off the hook. But at its best, self-compassion has both accountability and that space for learning and growth to be happening in the mess and the magic of what it is to work together. So those are the us and the me skills. And again, I'll pause there because that's a bit to take in, and then we can dive more into the we, the team, and leader skills we can use as well.
Yeah, I'm just wondering with the us and the me skills, what are some of the things that we can do that's going to stop the trigger around, some of the stuff we talked about was financial crisis. Some of the stuff you talked about was, psychosocial safety and psychological safety in the workplace. And, many of us have EAP programs in workplaces, but I often wonder if leaders actually know how to get their people to use those EAP facilities. Like, it's okay to say, there's a number you can call, there's an app you can use. But when we're talking about, things like we've just talked about why this cohort are quietly cracking, what are some of the how do I guess what I'm trying to ask is how do I get people to ensure they're using it in the right way?
Yeah, it's interestingly one of the pieces of feedback we've had from clients this year is that their calls to EAP services have gone up. And
Increased.
one of the
Mm.
topics that most people are calling on is cost of living crisis for support. And that
Mm.
to me makes sense because often we don't want to talk to our boss
No.
about our cost of living crisis because it brings up all sorts of uncomfortable questions, perhaps, and doesn't feel appropriate in the workplace. So I'm encouraged by the fact that people are calling EAP when they're having cost of living pressures, that they're talking to someone. Yep, to me is the most important step because it's only in talking to someone that we're able to start getting some of the support that we might need to navigate that context. I think as leaders, we can absolutely be role modeling and talking about that. Hey guys, I know there's a lot of pressure out there in the world at
Mm.
the moment. I don't love the term polycrisis. I think that's scary for many of us to think about, but I do find the language of we're in this super cycle of change can be really helpful just to normalize for people. If life feels like a lot right now, it is, and there's not an obvious light at the end to this tunnel. It's not like a global pandemic where we're all going to get vaccinated or borders will lift and we'll kind of think we'll go back to some version of what we were before. This super cycle of change, really, we are only at the beginning of, and the next 10 years will take its toll as this plays out. There's going to be some pretty significant shifts need to happen in the ways many of us are working and living. And so we need to be preparing our people for the long game here, not
Mm.
just this moment in time of, oh, it's just an inflation thing or it's just a food thing, it's going to come back down. I mean, even our governments at best are saying the next 3 years, this cost of living issue is not likely to recede. And
Mm.
honestly, given our environmental challenges, whether we believe in climate change or not, I think we can see the practical impacts of some of the shifts that are happening. This will be an ongoing challenge for some time until we shift some of the ways we are living.
Mm. I'm often saying to leaders that, and I know in myself, there is a marked difference to how I led in 2019
Yeah,
to how I lead in 2025. And then I'm always focusing down to 2030 because
yeah,
I know that in the next 4.5 years, which will go in a heartbeat,
yeah,
my leading skills will need to change again, and not just subtly, but it's
yeah.
almost a completely new set of skill sets
It
I will
really is.
require.
Yeah.
But I can't do that when I get to 2030. I've got to do it now because all of the things that we're talking about that's happening in our environments that is out of our control is actually starting to happen now, and we keep saying the pace of change is fast, but it's the slowest it's ever going to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And I think the piece we're often missing is not just that the pace of change is fast, but the complexity of change. The messiness of it is unlike most things any of us have ever navigated before. And so this requires, to your point, a completely different set of skills as leaders and team members. And again, not to just think of, oh, this is a moment in time, we'll wait it out, but actually, this is the new normal and our ways of working for the foreseeable future. And so, we were really curious, what do you offer leaders and teams then
Yeah.
in that space? What is having any impact? And, the last few years, of course, here in Australia, many leaders have become more aware of the emotional and social impact of the work that we're doing. And we did find that the most frequently experienced psychosocial hazard in workplaces at this time is poor change management.
Mm.
So when we ask leaders and team members, well, what's going on with poor change management? Like, if all we've got in front of us is a super cycle of change, having the skills to lead and navigate poor change management seems like a pretty important requirement. And right now, probably in your workplace as you're listening, is a control that you need to be prioritizing legally as well as for
Mm.
performance and well-being of your team. So a lot of reasons to now really be looking at this.
Mm.
Most often, what we hear, I'll be curious if this resonates for you, is the biggest challenge for poor change management is poor communication.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
And we find team members are pointing their fingers at leaders, going, well, leaders don't tell us what's going on. And leaders are pointing their fingers at the organization, going, well, we don't get timely information. And both the organization and leaders are pointing their fingers at employees, going, we tell them and they don't listen or read.
A lot of fingers being pointed
There's
at
a
each
lot of
other.
fingers going on. The one thing we can all agree on, I find, is when we ask, well, do you really need more emails or meetings or town halls? Everybody's pretty clear, no. None
Mm.
of us need more than that.
Mm.
And so we find it's not more communication we need, but better connection.
Mm.
We actually need chances to feel connected with each other, to be figuring out what's going on in these things, to make space for the emotional and social conversations,
Mm.
rather than just treating it like a project plan and a task that can be allocated. So we found in this research that there were 5 factors that we've called HEART, because it's the emotional and social part of change. So the heart of change factors is what we called them. The H is for honour emotions. I was working with a Victorian government department recently with their HR leader, and she said, look, Michelle, all emotions are welcome in our team, but not all behaviours are. And I think that's
I
such an
like that.
important distinction, right? That all emotions are welcome because they're just data about how we're feeling about what's going on. It's better to have access to that data than be hiding or burying it away. But that doesn't excuse poor behaviour. Emotions are welcome. Some of that is your emotional work to do, others is our work to do together. The E is to engage purposefully. What do people care enough to own? What are they intrinsically motivated to take accountability for, so that we're not playing this accountability blame game or, chase and tag game down the track, but we're actually getting on with the things that we said we want to do. The A is to appreciate strengths. I think we're seeing a big re-interest in strengths development in workplaces. I think about 5 years ago, we saw lots of people taking strength surveys like Gallup or the Values in Action VIA survey or other tools. And then, they'd talk about them, we'd all love that, and then we'd all file it away and never think about it again. But as a control for many psychosocial hazards like role clarity, job control, reward and recognition, achievable job demands, this is a really powerful tool. And I think we're going to see a resurgence of that in 2026. The R is for reaching out for help, God forbid, and then accepting it in ways that we're not trying to rescue each other, but we're building capability in each other. And the T is to take tiny steps. How do we keep
Mm.
shrinking down complexity? You cannot plan complex change very far in advance reliably. And that's a challenge for us as leaders because we love the illusion that we can plan out a change and it'll all flow step by step because it restores some sense of control. But complex change, you do something, it ripples through the system, and you have to see how that lands really before you know what's the right next thing to do. So we're going to need to get better at taking tiny steps, sensing, learning, and adapting before we start to do the next thing.
Mm. Before we go back to the previous conversation, because I do want to talk about the collective
Yeah, sure.
in your survey, With the heart framework, how do leaders find out more about that? I mean, is that something that your business does with organizations? Because there's a whole
Yeah.
range of behavior and systems and change that goes into that acronym. How do leaders connect with that or bring that practice into their business?
Yeah, so firstly, head to the Change Labs with an S on the end there.com. That's our website. You can get the research report for free where we're showing you this data, but you'll also find a free podcast series there where we walk through each of the factors in an episode. We share what we're seeing organizations do. And then, yes, if you want more, we do have everything from digital toolboxes of what leaders can do to training programs. This year in particular, we've started running a lot of training in workplaces where we're teaching leaders how to plan with this, how to do it in the midst of things. But we're really seeing this need that organisations are going, we need a control for poor change management
Mm,
that is not just about pumping more communication in that nobody is responding to. So how do we do that? We do it with heart. The other skill we found really important for leaders is to teach them how to ask better questions
mm,
that create this connection, not just this one-way communication. And so a lot of what we've been doing is teaching leaders to not just ask, we call them ordinary questions. How are you? Why didn't we meet this deadline? What went wrong here? To more extraordinary questions that are emotionally and socially designed to support people's learning and development. And that's not a hard thing to do once we know how to do it, but is a skill that most of us as leaders have not been taught or seen role
oh,
modeled
we've,
well.
we've never had to be like that.
Right.
Like,
Yeah. We could
and
be more directive.
100%. And leaders are under pressure to meet, P&L bottom lines and report to
Yeah.
the board as well. And so they're under their own pressures on performance. And so, it just flows downhill, unfortunately.
It really does until performance again starts to lose traction
Yeah.
because emotionally and socially we're quietly cracking or burning out.
Yeah.
And now we need a different set of tools, to your point. And these are the tools.
So let's go back to the third cohort, which is, the collective. Tell me more
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. So when we talk about the collective at the organizational
Yep.
level,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
So the organizational level, these heart factors also play out there. One of the things that was interesting to me was we tried to gauge how successful is change in Australian workplaces right now. And we found that it was around about 58% of change was unsuccessful by self-report of people. And we're like, okay, how can we improve that? Like what makes it more likely to be successful than not? And again, these same 5 heart factors came up that if we had this organizational lens to heart, then it was more likely to be 69%, so 11% more successful than what we were seeing at the average. But equally, if we didn't have these heart factors in play in some way, we actually dropped even further. It was only 47% of change was successful without these emotional and social supports in there. So, same thing is again, do we have a culture that honors feelings, where people can talk honestly and openly? Really, we're coming to the heart of psychological safety there. Dr. Amy Edmondson's work. I know lots of organisations in Australia have been trying to play with how do we create these cultures where we are open and honest and we're here to learn and grow together. I
Mm.
think about Dr. Carol Dweck's work, which I know many organisations have been playing with as well, around growth mindsets and learning cultures and knowing that, well, outcomes matter. Most are pretty short lived. And really, the gold in our organisation, what we're buying in terms of capability, is people's capacity to keep learning and growing as context keeps shifting. And that's never been more important. The engage purposefully is how are we supporting more self-organisation rather than pretending that it's okay to settle for compliance when what we need is commitment and accountability to behaviours. The appreciating strengths is your HR people management system set up through a strengths lens. When you do performance reviews, development plans, recruitment, promotion, are you promoting with a strength lens to that? Or are we just looking for the candidate with the fewest weaknesses that we can
Yeah.
manage, right? Reaching out for help. Do we have cultures of help? I think Dr. Adam Grant at Wharton has been writing beautifully about this. I know many of his books are popular in Australian workplaces, particularly his book on give and take. But a lot of the research in workplaces shows the biggest thing standing between us and success is our willingness to ask each other for help, because when we do, we expand resources, ideas, networks that we can tap into. And then the last one on the take tiny steps. Again, we can still have a plan forward, but we need to be realistic through an organizational lens that without the skills and tools to sense and learn and adapt, the plans aren't worth the paper that they're written on
Mm.
because the context keeps shifting as we try to execute our plans.
Mm. So we've talked a lot about quietly cracking for a younger generation.
Mm.
What's happening with in the leadership arena? So, your executives, your CEOs, what did you see there?
Yeah, it's interesting both in terms of the data and then I would say more anecdotal and curious what you're hearing on this front as well. In terms of the data, once we were sort of at 45 years and above, we were still sitting at like 53.4%. Leaders 55 and over were at 35%. So they were our least likely to be quietly cracking. There definitely is kind of an age curve to some of this. I don't know about you. I'm 52 now, and I think at 52, I'm much better at dealing with the context ebbing and flowing around me.
You've
I've
got more
got more
life
skills and lived
experience.
experience,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't panic me in the same way that it used
Yeah.
to.
But
So we
but
are
but sorry,
seeing
just
that.
sorry,
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt there, but you're also probably you own a house, you probably
right.
have an investment property, you've probably got
Absolutely.
super in the bank, you're married
Right.
with kids,
Yeah,
you've paid down a lot of your mortgage. So
yeah,
you know, so the affordability crisis might be biting you,
yeah,
but it's not impacting how you lead your life in
absolutely.
that cohort. So I think it's
Absolutely.
yeah, and
Yeah.
like so I can understand why that was low.
Yeah. And then I think the other piece, the work context to it as well. Again, we often have more autonomy in more senior
Mm.
roles, so we can make more choices. We're setting more of the plans. We maybe don't feel quite so much at the mercy of context. And again, we've got, longer careers behind us that know, if I have to adapt or pivot here career-wise, I've got a base on which I can build on that our young people don't have. So that was interesting in the data. I think anecdotally, certainly, what we've been hearing more from senior leaders this year is an exhaustion
Mm,
of just trying to lead is like taking it out, but also people being ready to call it and go, you know what, I think I'm done.
I'm done.
Yeah, and we're seeing lots of senior leaders exit out of roles, going, "This is just it's too much." From global pandemics to all of this now to looking at what's ahead, and there's not an obvious light at the end of the tunnel. I've run my race, and I feel like I want to go spend my life doing other things if I have the financial freedom to make that choice.
What I find interesting is that since 2023, we've had a lot of compliance and legislation
Yeah,
come in, which was designed to stop that burnout from happening.
yeah,
But there's a real gap between compliance and
huge.
culture, right?
Yeah.
What does that tell us? Like, how do we fix that? Because even though there's about four different pieces of legislation that came in around a whole range of things to protect people, but it's clearly not doing what it's supposed to do.
Not yet. I mean, a lot of that legislation is still relatively new. And
Mm,
so I do think culture change, in my experience with lots of organizations around the world, I really would give it sort of 18 months at the earliest, but more like the 3 to 5 year mark is where I really start to gauge, have we got traction? Have we got movement in the direction we want? Is it embedding and holding and not being a flash in the pan kind of scenario? So I do think it's still a little early to call, is it changing? We did see burnout rates, which have been climbing the last few years, actually stabilise. Now, it's still too high, but it didn't continue to climb this year. And I'm curious to see whether we'll see that hold and a decline coming off or not in the data with all the psychosocial work. That said, you're absolutely right. Too many organisations are still approaching these legislation changes as a compliance tick the box requirement rather than what they can be used for, which is this disruption in our organisational cultures to prepare for this future that is ahead, to create a culture that is socially and emotionally conscious and
mm,
supportive
mm.
and adaptive to the challenges of this cycle of complexity and pace of change in which we now are all living.
Yeah. Do you know, I often hear a generation of leaders constantly saying, this work from home nonsense has got to stop. And it's like, we are so beyond that. We are
Well, and I always think
so
if you
beyond
can't
that.
trust your people to work from home, that to me is not a reflection on your people, but your leadership. Because
Correct.
if you can't trust your people, what does that say about the leadership and the accountability that you've embedded?
So
I,
what should boards be doing in terms of the burnout issue with leaders and executives? Because here's my concern, right? You have a bunch of leaders in their 40s and 50s who are operating under significant pressure at the moment, given all the change that we're going through that we've, spoken about today. You have a level of burnout, disconnection, they're exhausted. But then you've got a cohort of leaders below them who are going through their own issues and quietly cracking, as you've pointed out in your research, looking at what their leaders are going through right now and probably going, well, I don't want to climb this ladder
yeah.
to get up to the top and experience what they've just experienced because nothing seems to be changing at an organizational level. So then how do boards and executives around board tables ensure that not only are they looking after their existing leaders, but they've got a pipeline of people who want to climb up the damn ladder to get up there, or we're going to have a real leadership issue in our country, or
Yeah.
globally probably.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's interesting. I think what we will see are many leaders going out to freelance and contract and develop other things because they will go, these organizational systems are not healthy places that are designed to set us up for success. And I think we've already seen a lot of that in the market over the last decade. And I think as technologies continue to make that more flexible and easier to access, just the cost even of accessing technology to work in that way comes down. I think we will see that continued shift. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a story of
Mm,
and here that
yeah.
actually having some more of that flexibility, fresh thinking people outside the system, can be a very healthy thing. And you still need some leaders in play that are
Mm,
going to be there in the system, want to be in the system, are thriving in the system. The thing I've seen make the biggest difference this year is when the executive teams are getting social and emotional coaching so
mm,
that they are number one being supported for their own well-being and any risk of burnout and that. But number two, we're working out the kinks in behavior, the funny patterns we've picked up, the stories we've spent our careers telling ourselves that are not fit for purpose for this moment in time in which we're landing. And I get it. When you're in an executive role and you're on the line for delivering the KPIs of your organization, the idea that you can't control and plan every step of that is a hard way to sleep at night, except for when you understand how the human brain and nervous system actually work. And the moment you get that, you start to realize I was always living a lie anyway, which is why it was so hard.
mm,
When we are able to educate and coach and work with executives and board members, honestly, to understand how the human brain and nervous system actually performs at its best, then all these kind of social, emotional, heart-based practices suddenly make way more sense.
mm.
But it needs support because often we're rewiring long-term
Yeah.
patterns of behavior in our leaders to scaffold that shift and change. The beauty is as they do it, it ripples quite quickly down through the organization. And honestly, I think that kind of coaching for executives is the most important psychosocial control any board can be putting in place.
Mm. Now, you introduced a safety check chat, which is a simple set of questions that can shift the safety of a team. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so this is based on Dr. Amy Edmondson's work of psychological safety. I've been fortunate over the years to have conversations with Amy, also Dr. Carol Dweck, who we mentioned earlier, and Kristen Neff. She is one of the world's leading researchers on self-compassion, which we touched on as a skill. And as I was playing with their research and we were teaching it in organizations, I was like, how do you simplify this so that very busy leaders and teams can actually tap into these skills quickly to get the outcomes that they need? So we developed this safety check chat of 4 questions. And the first is what's working well? And the reason we start with what's working well is to help the brain feel safe enough,
Mm-hmm.
number one. But also, even in the situations that are falling apart, feels like nothing's working, there's always something there.
Something.
Even if it's just we're having a conversation about it,
Yeah.
that is working well. And we don't want to throw out those strengths. We want to build on them because we're actually wired for these things to happen individually and collectively in our
Mm.
workplace. Second question is, where are we struggling? And
Mm.
Carol and Amy were really big on this question of normalizing struggle and taking the shame out of it and starting to see that this is just how we all learn and grow. And it's so interesting when we suggest that question in organizations, you learn a lot about the culture straight away because for some of them, even the word struggle is unimaginable.
Mm.
Challenge, opportunity, those ones are, but struggle. And I really challenge, I'm like, if you need to change the word, but sit with the question about why are we too scared to talk about struggle when struggle is nothing other than our brains and bodies saying there's a moment of learning and growth here. Am I going to lean towards it or away from it? So where are we struggling is the second question. The third, which Carol always points out is the most important, is what are we learning from the strength and the struggle? And the reason she points this out, she says, if you think about all the outcomes you worked so hard this year to achieve, most of them you probably can't even remember right now. But what you got to take forward, whether you got there or not, was the learning from each of those moments. And so from the strength and struggle, what matters is what are we learning so we can
Mm.
take the fourth and final question, which is, and what do we want to do next?
Yeah. What great questions, Michelle, for any organization. You almost can ask yourself quarterly on that one.
Yeah, and we find, look, some teams leaders will use it as a psychosocial safety check-in with a team member where they can see something. Hey, let's just unpack this. What's working? Where are we struggling? What are we learning? What do you want to do next?
Mm.
Other times we've got teams who'll have it as a standing agenda item or a project debrief or things like that. But they are designed to help us neurologically and in our nervous systems stay connected with each other to do the learning and the growing
Mm.
rather than getting defensive and disconnecting from what's in
Mm.
play because we feel embarrassed, ashamed, overwhelmed, think we're not good enough. That self-criticism hijacked us to get in the way of doing the work we want to do with
Mm.
each other.
I want to pick up something you said earlier, which was civility in the workplace and how connected it is to AI, because the reality is that most of us are using AI in some way, shape, or form in the workplace. I know I use it a lot,
Yeah.
but I'm interested with the connection that well-being drops with frequent use of AI. I would have thought it would do the opposite because AI is supposed to will give us back some time because it's doing all the grunt work or the research work. Like I can put a piece of research into ChatGPT and say, give me the top 15 points from this research that I need to be aware of. And whereas before I'd have had to set aside 2 hours to read the paper and, find those 10 points for myself. So I'm interested to know why it's not doing what I had assumed it would do.
Yeah, well, again, I just want to say, even the best research on human behavior tells us what works for some of the people some of the time. So,
Yeah,
for some of us
fair.
using AI tools, it may be improving our well-being and our civility. This data suggests that on average, that experience is different for many employees. Look, you're right in part in that we definitely saw in the data that there was an improvement in performance for people that were using AI tools. Interestingly, this also does a bit of a U-shape, a bit like the quiet cracking, in that those who were rarely using AI tools at that time were still saying, look, score of 73 out of 100 for my performance. When they sometimes start using it, I think that learning curve we all experience with AI tools, performance actually drops a little bit down to 69 out of 100. And then when they're often using it, we see it come back out the other side and they end up at 76 out of 100 on average. So actually better than those who aren't using it. So that part of the story is very consistent with what we saw across workers' experience. But you're right, what's going on in the background is perhaps a little different from your own lived experience with it. And one of those things was well-being specifically. So if I was rarely using AI, my well-being actually was reasonably healthy and
Mm.
high. But the moment I sometimes or often, a bit like quiet cracking, it just comes straight down and it stays down. Now, I don't know about your experiences with AI. I use it a lot most days at work as well. And definitely there are some times where it improves my performance and well-being. There are other times where I've had to set up some rules for AI usage
Yes.
for myself, which is if I get to all caps, it's time to walk
Yeah.
away
Yeah.
before I
Yeah.
start throwing the keyboard and things like that around. And so I definitely think when it's going well, it's awesome for our well-being, but there's a certain unpredictability to it, either because of the prompts we're using, the programming updates that go on in the background that often we've got no no idea on. So it worked fine yesterday. Exact same prompt,
Mm,
suddenly not
doesn't
working.
work
How do I
today.
make it work? And of course, it's always when you're on deadline to have something in. And now it's like, I've got to use neural pathways I haven't used for a while. How do I kick
Mm,
those into gear? I do think there is also some unreliability with it. So it was interesting when we were doing this report, I actually, in a parallel process, manually did all the data analysis and crunching, but I used the AI tools at the same time because it was part of my learning curve and I was curious. I will tell you that frequently the AI tool got the calculation wrong.
wrong.
And even when I'd given it the calculation and I was using it to help me write the summary notes on the report pages, it often would still mix up the calculation even that I had given it. And so I think these things are kind of, having an impact on our well-being. The other piece was civility. I mean, again, in the past when we've done these kind of reports in our team, a whole lot of us will come together for a couple of days and we'll look at the data and we'll toss around the storylines and things like that. This time it was quicker and easier for me to do a lot of that thinking with the AI tool in partnership and then take those ideas to the team for feedback. But what we missed, I was reflecting later, was, often some of our best memories of a team is, oh, remember when we cracked
Mm,
that insight or we came up with that piece of language. We didn't have that collective memory of doing this piece in the way we had other data, so other pieces of data. So I just think there's impact. We need to be measuring it as leaders, not just for performance, but also well-being and relationships and
mm.
keeping an eye on that.
I find it interesting that you found that there's a drop in self-compassion for those people who are using AI regularly. Why do we get harsher on ourselves?
My suspicion, and it's just that on this, and could be some personal bias here, is that when we're using the AI tools, even though they are talking very compassionately and supportively to us, number one, sometimes there is other data that suggests we stop believing that so much. In fact, some of the tweaking in different AI models has been making them feel like they're less sucking up to us and telling us everything is good. But I think the other thing is we assume that it's always us and not the tool, right?
Mm,
Everybody else is talking about how good AI is for their productivity and how fantastic it is. So when a prompt doesn't work or you can't get what you want out of the tool, I think the fastest thing our brain does, because we're wired to attack any source of threat, including ourselves, is we blame ourselves with this technology. It's like,
mm,
I'm
so
no good at
true.
prompting, I can't figure this out. And
Yeah,
even worse, we hide that because we think everybody else has really got it going on here. But it's
yeah,
just me. And if my boss finds out I don't know how to use this tool, then where's that going to leave me? So I think there's a
yeah.
lot of self-criticism in play here.
Yeah, so true. Now, I've got to ask you, since we've been talking about quite cracking, have you had your own experience of quite cracking and what helped you steady yourself again?
Yeah, look, I've definitely had moments of it. It's been so interesting since doing this research, even just moments through this super cycle of change of going, oh my God, it feels like too much. The world feels too much. The work feels too much. What the heck do I do? And so I have been playing with those heart questions from
Mm,
a personal perspective of almost like, okay, deep breath, kid, like, how are you feeling? Let's just be honest, nothing to hide or pretend here. What do you care enough to own in this moment? One small thing, where do you want to go? Appreciate my strengths. What's a strength I could align now to this movement forward? Who do I need to ask for help, even if it's just telling someone, hey, I'm kind of drowning over here?
mm,
And then just one small tiny step forward. So that has definitely helped. If I reflect in the past before we had the research and understood those things, maybe I reached for bits of it. I've spent more than 15 years now researching this
mm,
kind of space. So definitely at times using my strengths have helped. Sometimes getting honest about what's really going on for any of us emotionally, that can be hard and vulnerable. I do tend to go to micromanaging and controlling in the past to like self-soothe. And I definitely will not reach out for help unless it's my last resort. So it's kind of been helpful having the little heart checklist to just go, okay, how do I not just fall back on the things I've tried in
mm,
the past but aren't working now, or I wouldn't be in this situation, but what might I be missing and where do I go for support?
mm. So, Michelle, we've come to a point in time in our conversation where we play what we call a spotlight shuffle. So there's 20 questions with numbers against them. If you were sitting in front of me, I'd get you to pick them out of a box, but we're not, so we'll do them virtually. And maybe we'll try and answer them relating it back to the survey that we've
Sure.
done. So pick your first number.
7.
Number 7. Okay. What's the hardest part of leadership no one talks about enough?
think the loneliness. We think everybody else has got it figured out. It's just us that hasn't, and that leaves us feeling very lonely and isolated when help would be really valuable.
Mm, fair enough. How, I'll ask another question on top of that one. What's the best advice you have for leaders to be not lonely? Because and I'll tell you what I do is I have a great tribe around me. I have people that I can connect with, call, send an email, send a text message, whatever my situation is. And so I don't feel lonely. What's your advice on that?
Remember, nobody has it all figured out. There's not a
Mm,
single one of us that are getting it right all of the time.
yeah.
Our brains are not meant to. We're wired for learning and growth and to be perfectly imperfect. And so nobody has it figured out. There's no shame in it. Exactly as you're describing. Reach out. That's how you build your tribe, is through
Mm,
those moments of asking for help.
yeah. All right. Next number.
13.
What's one book, film, or podcast that shaped how you think about leadership?
I think definitely Carol Dweck's growth mindset for me was a big aha as a leader. It was partly that realizing none of us had it all figured out, and that the point wasn't getting perfect results. The point was doing as much learning and growing as I could each
Mm,
week so that I kept building my capability. And so that freed me from so much micromanaging and controlling and anxiety about what if the numbers weren't there, and instead gave me the permission, as Carol once generously told me, Michelle, you're human just like everybody else.
yeah.
Maybe just get on with the learning and growth.
Yeah, yeah. I like that. Another number?
Let's try 3.
What's the most exciting possibility you see in the future of leadership or work?
Think as hard as the super cycle of change that we are facing into is, and I don't want to underplay it all, I think there will be a lot of uncomfortable challenges in front of all of us for work and life in this decade ahead. There's also a lot of possibility. Whenever things are
Mm,
creating that much shift, it means that there's the opportunities to do things differently. And if I look back on the last decade of our workplace lives, I don't know that that much of it was great consistently. Like I look
mm,
at the loneliness, I look at the burnout, I look at like this was a system that has been breaking for some
yeah,
time. And so
yeah.
in some ways I'm like, well, maybe there's enough sort of loosening coming in the crumbling of these systems that something better can emerge. I like to think of that visual of like the flower growing out of the concrete crack when I think about where perhaps are we heading. So again, I don't want to underplay the challenges and how uncomfortable that will be for many of us ahead. And I actually think if we can get this emotional social part right,
Mm,
not only would work be way more joyful, but I think we'd be far more successful, all of us.
mm. All right, one last number.
Oh, 2.
Number two, you like your lower numbers, don't you? What's one future shift you think leaders aren't prepared for but should be?
I do think right now we're not talking honestly enough about the super cycle of change or the polycrisis that we're facing into. When I'm at board tables and leadership tables, I don't hear enough discussion about what is going to happen to the disruption of our supply chains.
Mm,
What is going to happen when we outsource ownership of so much of our data and intelligence to third party companies like AI companies
mm,
on whom we are then completely dependent and strip much of that capability out of our people capacity in our organizations? I think we're rushing towards a fool's gold without thinking through all of the consequences. And again, I don't think it's either or. I think it's an and, but I don't see enough of the and conversation happening.
Good point. How has your research landed in organizations?
With lots of interest. Again, the
Mm,
moment we say quiet cracking, heads start nodding, and people are like, where is the data?
yeah,
Please give
yeah,
us the
yeah.
data.
Yeah.
We provide the data. When we talk about poor change management being the biggest risk, nobody is surprised. When we talk about the challenge of not communication but connection, again, everybody's heads nod. And then we get to the hard part about how do we actually build these skills that many of us don't currently have
Mm,
and roll up our sleeves and get on with the work. And I just want to acknowledge for us as leaders, that can be really confronting and challenging to go, I have to build a whole set of emotional and social skills that probably largely at this point in my life I tried to avoid as
yeah.
best I can. And now you are,
Mm,
it's deeply personal and not easy work. And I take my hat off to every leader that has the courage to walk into that. And the good
mm,
news is we are seeing leaders, going, yep, that's me. And if that's you listening to it, then please keep going. We need more
mm.
of it.
If leaders were to take one insight from the research that you've done in terms of how they support their people over the next 12 months, what would it be?
I think be realistic about the context in which your people are living. As much as you might like to think they can just come to work and get on with the job, that's not how our brains and nervous systems work. Your people are carrying a lot right now in the world around them. Never mind then what they get to work and find as well. And really start thinking about how are we understanding how people's brains and nervous systems work and the role of our leaders in supporting that, not making it harder to get the outcomes we want.
So, Michelle, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for doing the research. I think it's so critical in terms of what you've done and the information you've allowed leaders to have in terms of what's happening in their organization, how people are feeling, and some of the things that they need to do. I love the HEART acronym that you've got and all the work around that. If people want to connect with you or download the research paper, how do they do that?
Yeah, so they head to the Change Labs with the S on the
With the
end
S
dot
on the
com,
end?
or just Google Michelle McQuaid. You will find all of our stuff. And again, lots of free podcasts and resources there to start with. And then if you're wanting more support, plenty of options for that as well.
Michelle, thank you for joining us on Future Fit Leadership. This is such a great conversation because it's exactly what a future fit leader needs to hear. But thank you again for your time.
Thanks for having me.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate, and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.